Thank you for joining our weekly live podcast recording of Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And I'm glad to have you here today. Just a couple of things before we dive into our topic today, which is what is change management and digital transformation. We're going to today cover all the things related to change management that you need to know and might want to know about change management. But before I dive into the topic here today and into the general discussion, a couple of logistical things. First of all, as I mentioned, this is a weekly live recording of our podcast called Transformation Ground Control. And you can find that podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, or you can go to Apple Music or any podcast platform to find it, or we stream to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter as well. Every Wednesday, new episodes come out. So we're recording next week's episode here today, and you're part of that live production. So thank you for being here. This podcast will be released, or this episode will be released a week from tomorrow on Wednesday. Second thing is today's a very interactive discussion. As you can see, I do not have a guest here today. It's going to be a solo discussion about change management, which quite frankly is sometimes awkward for me. So anything you can do to help engage and ask questions, provide comments, that'll make this a lot more interactive and interesting, and certainly take the burden off of me quite a bit. So I appreciate in advance any chat questions you might have related to change management. And I'm going to dive into the audience questions. That's going to be kind of the main focus here today, because we don't have a guest. You really are the guest. So any questions you have, please drop them in the chat on whatever platform you're watching. And speaking of the chat, if you could just drop in the chat where in the world you're joining from today. This is a global change management and a global digital transformation community that we're part of. And it's always fun to see what city and country everyone is here today. So I'd love to see where you're from. Please drop in the chat. And I'm watching the chat as we go here today. So any questions you might drop there, I will see them, and I'll get to as many questions as I can here today. So that's the logistical stuff I wanted to cover. Thank you again for being here. Again, today's topic, what is change management in digital transformation? To get started, I suppose it'd be also interesting to hear what is your role in change management. Are you a change management consultant or practitioner or team member? Are you part of a digital transformation? You're just interested in learning more about change management. Perhaps your organization is going through some sort of change and you're trying to figure out how to navigate that change. I'd love to hear just sort of where you guys are coming from and what some of your roles are, or what your interest in change management stems from. I'd love to hear your feedback in addition to hearing where you're from here today. So thank you in advance for sharing that with us. So to get started, what I thought I'd do just to sort of set the context here today is I do have a couple slides I'm going to share kind of from my hip pocket, if you will. I'm not going to go through a formal presentation per se, but I do have a couple visuals that I want to pop up on the screen to really just set the context for the discussion. And I've got some excess materials that I can pull from depending on where the conversation goes here today. But one of the things I wanted to start with is to, before we get into what change management is, maybe back up a little bit and talk about why change management is important, because I think that's an important thing to talk about. Because a lot of times when we work with clients, one of the dynamics we see is that we deal with a lot of executives and leaders within organizations who have this assumption that change management's important, but it's more important to other organizations. For their own organizations, oftentimes executives and leaders have this false assumption that change isn't going to be that difficult because our team is ready for change. We hear this all the time from our client base. Our team is ready for change. Change is difficult for other organizations, but for us, it's not going to be difficult because our processes are so broken and people recognize the need for change. Our systems are super outdated and people are frustrated with the technology and they're ready for change. And so while those statements may be true, what ends up happening oftentimes is organizations falsely believe that because people are quote unquote ready for change, or they think they're ready for change, that the change management itself is going to be easy, and it's going to be easier than most other organizations. And one thing I want to do is, and this is a good visual that I want to pop up here on the screen just to show why that's not true and what some of the things are to think about as it relates to change management and really the need for change, is this concept here that I'm putting in front of you. Some of these common challenges that organizations have from a people perspective is that there's two different types of resistance to change or change management challenges. There's what I would call the intentional resistance to change. And this is where, you find people on your team that are flat out trying to sabotage the project. They don't want the change. They don't believe in the change. They're not bought in at all. They don't like the idea of change. And therefore they're going to push back and resist in their own way, whatever that manifests itself in. And that's, quite frankly, is pretty rare. You don't see a lot of that in most organizations. You don't have, large pockets of people that are flat out intentionally resisting change. You have some of it. I mean, every organization has a little bit of that, but usually it's manageable and organizations can overcome that. What I would say this is the most dangerous, the most difficult change to navigate is the more common and the more subtle type of resistance to change, which is essentially the other three buckets that you see on your screen here: the unintentional resistance, the misunderstanding, misalignment. Those are the three real root causes of significant resistance to change. And unintentional resistance is oftentimes hard to see because on the surface, people want change typically when you're going through an organization. Um, but when you start to peel back the onion and you start to get into the details of what change means and how it's going to manifest itself within your organization and how it's going to impact individuals within your organization, that's where people start to push back or they start to panic a little bit. They start to have fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They start to question the types of changes. They start to find problems or potential issues or perceived issues with the types of changes that are being rolled out to the organization. And as you get into those details, as the transformation progresses, that's where the biggest source of resistance comes from. And usually leaders don't see that coming. It's almost like the iceberg theory. They see a tip of an iceberg. They might see a tiny little bit of resistance to change in that in that intentional resistance that I talked about, but they don't see all the stuff below the surface, the real base of the iceberg. They don't see that because on the surface, the tip of the iceberg, they see people that want change. They're on board. They're excited about it. They recognize the need for change. But then as the project progresses, that's where the lower hidden parts of the iceberg reveal themselves. And so that unintentional resistance is what organizations really have to be careful of. And then there's two other types of sources of people challenges that lead to resistance typically, which somewhat overlaps with unintentional resistance, but is worth calling out separately here, which is misunderstanding, misalignment. So if employees don't understand and have clear direction and clear understanding of what their jobs are going to look like in the future and what business processes are going to look like in the future, they just don't understand because no one's communicated that to them or it hasn't been shared with them. That misunderstanding will typically lead to resistance to change. And same with misalignment. If an organization is not on the same page, if they're not rowing in the same direction and headed in the same direction, that misalignment creates these sort of headwinds that will make change management very difficult, if not impossible. And so the key is, how do we get our team aligned and make sure that we're all on the same page, especially at the leadership level? It starts with the leadership, but then it sort of trickles down through the organization as well. So very important to address that as well. So this visual right here is meant to show that there's different types of resistance to change, and the most important sources and the most significant sources of resistance to change are those that are unintentional. And so I think that's important to point out because a lot of leaders misunderstand that. And I think that's something that if you're not a leader or you are trying to manage expectations of your leadership team, that's a useful concept to share with them, because I think a lot of them are overly optimistic and assume the best when I don't want to say you should be assuming the worst, but you should assume that there's a lot underneath the surface of that iceberg that you don't see yet until you do a more formalized organizational assessment, organizational readiness assessment, which is something we can get to here as we continue the conversation here today. So that being said, I guess that's a long way of saying change management is really important, and it's probably more important than most teams and organizations fully understand. And unfortunately, most organizations don't fully realize or understand how important change management is and how difficult resistance to change is and how widespread resistance to change is until they get into the project and they start going down the path of their transformation and they get deep into the testing process and even into training. And then they realize, wow, people are really resisting this change. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of chaos. And if that's the moment when you realize that change management is going to be important, we should probably invest some time in change management. It's too late. I mean, you can try to mitigate as much as you can, but you've waited too long and you should have started change management a lot sooner. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of organizations are, and they hire us sort of midstream to try and correct and remediate some of that. It can be done, and it's better than just ignoring it and assuming that it'll just go away, because it won't. But if you're early enough in the process where you can affect that focus and affect that perception around change management, that's certainly something that's going to be super beneficial. Just real quickly, though, I want to turn to the audience, with that sort of intro or backdrop being set, and just look at where people are joining from today. I appreciate everyone dropping in the chat where you're joining from. We have someone from Denver, Colorado, Mumbai, India, New Jersey, Golden, Colorado. A lot of people from Colorado here today, where I'm based. Bengaluru, India, Detroit, Michigan, JED in Saudi Arabia, Chicago, Illinois, Sweden, Portugal, London, UK, Lyon, France, Nashik, India, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Pakistan, etc. So thank you everyone for joining from all over the world today. It's great to see where you're joining from. So just a couple comments. Already we're getting some great questions and conversation going here in the chat on the different streams. So thank you for accommodating my request for lots of questions. So it takes some of the pressure off me and also makes it more interesting, hopefully, for everyone here. Here's a question from Ryan on LinkedIn that I think is a good one. It's a good sort of intro question or a backdrop setting question here, which is, how do you address resistance to change among employees or team members? It's a great question and something we want to get into and unpack here quite a bit here today. And there's a lot you can do. I mean, I started to mention that one of the first things you can do is an organizational assessment. And what I want to share here real quickly is just a real quick slide that sort of visualizes what this organizational assessment is. But generally speaking, what you want to do, and I'll share my screen here real quickly again. Generally, what you want to do is, first of all, understand and really dig into getting into the details or digging under the surface of what the potential sources of resistance might be. So I mentioned before, there's a couple different buckets. You have these sort of the intentional resistance, which is a lot easier to spot. And quite frankly, it's a lot, I don't want to say it's healthier, but it's a lot easier in that even though it's blatant, even though it's very powerful, at least you see it and you can attack it and you can address it when it's blatant intentional resistance. The unintentional resistance is a lot harder because oftentimes you don't see it coming. You don't know that people are going to resist it because on the surface, again, they want change, they support it, they're good employees and team members, they want what's best for the company, they want what's best for the team. But as you get through a project and you start digging into it and people start to realize that, wow, my business processes are really going to change, or even more important, more recently, with some of the advances in technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning and some of these technologies that are tectonic shifts in the way businesses operate in terms of efficiency gains or potential efficiency gains, what people start to question then is, wow, am I important to this organization? Am I going to be important to this organization anymore now that we're bringing in AI to do, X percent of my job? So that's an important thing to point out, is that, it's when you get into the details and you start to see the personal impact that these changes have, that's when people start to really push back. And one of the best ways to identify or to mitigate the risk or mitigate this resistance to change is, first of all, to understand and draw to the surface what the sources are and where that resistance is coming from. And that's where this organizational change readiness survey and analysis comes into play. And this is something we do for our clients all the time as sort of a first step to effective change management. And this is where we use quantitative surveys and qualitative focus groups within the organization to capture information around the culture of the organization, past experiences with changes, just the maturity levels of the organization, the general operational efficiencies and the processes, and just really understanding the lay of the land of really benchmarking the organization as a whole to other organizations we've worked with, but also even just benchmarking different departments or different locations within the same organizations to one another, to see how they compare to one another and to see where we think the pockets of resistance might percolate. And so if we can do that and we can really dig in and understand and predict where resistance to change is likely to come from, then we can be more proactive in creating that change strategy and plan. And so to answer Ryan's question about how do you address all this stuff, a lot of it depends on what you find in this organizational assessment. So just to give you a couple examples, if you go through this organizational assessment, and let's just say that you come to the conclusion that communication between different departments is broken. It's just not a collaborative organization. Departments generally don't talk to one another. There's breakdowns, data silos, that sort of thing. I think a lot of you could probably relate to that because a lot of organizations have that problem. If that's a key challenge or problem within an organization, one of the things we can expect is that the fact that now you're deploying, let's say, an enterprise-wide technology that is designed to break down some of those barriers and to create single sources of the truth and to get rid of some of those data silos, to create more end-to-end integrated business processes, that all is good stuff, right? That will all deliver business value at the end of the day to the organization if we deploy it right. But in the meantime, people are going to struggle with that because we know right now they're operating in silos and they've got their own myopic view of the world. Now we're asking them to look at end-to-end business processes and to break down some of those silos. And again, getting back to the point of intentional versus unintentional resistance, on the surface, most people probably won't push back on that concept. They'll agree that that makes sense. That's good for the business. That's good for us as a team, et cetera. But when you start digging into the details of what that means and how the technology is going to change your job and how now other people are affecting or affected by your own day-to-day jobs, that just creates anxiety. It creates uncertainty as to what that looks like. Now that we have, for example, end-to-end integrated processes and those data silos are gone, that could create a perception, or that could create a feeling for me personally. Let's just say I'm part of the change. That could create a feeling of, hey, my job is suddenly less important because now we've got automation of processes, we've got integrated processes, the data silos are gone. All that stuff that I had in my head with tribal knowledge and all the heroics I used to do my job before, suddenly that stuff isn't as important anymore because we've got technology now to do our jobs or to help us with our jobs more effectively. Again, we probably recognize that's best for the team, best for the organization, but for us personally, there's some questions around what that means to us individually. And that's where people get hung up. That's where suddenly I'm not as excited about this change as I was when we were talking about it in theory. Now that you're telling me that the process is going to change that much and things are going to be disrupted in that way, in the short term, especially, suddenly I'm not quite as excited about that. And I might not support the change as much. I want to show you a visual graphic here that sort of summarizes or illustrates this point a little bit more. But when you think about change management, and I'll let you kind of read the cartoon here and the bullets that go along with it, and I'll give some backdrop here. Hopefully you think it's as funny as I do. But this is a cartoon one of our team members created a couple years ago that sort of illustrates the point that when we have ownership and pride in our jobs, and a lot of you can probably relate to this, people that have been with the team for years, if not decades, they've built immense amounts of tribal knowledge. They've perfected and fine-tuned business processes for better or for worse, even if they can be improved, even if they're not ideal. They themselves have taken pride in developing those processes with limited tools, limited support, perhaps. And there's a lot of pride that goes with that. And so organizations and individuals within organizations have that sort of pride in what they've created. And when we come in as consultants, or if you come in as a leader or a digital transformation project team member, and we say, hey, we're going to change that process because it's broken and we're going to completely change it. We're going to automate it. We're going to put in technology and tools and all that stuff. Suddenly, again, we intuitively understand it's probably best for the organization and best for the team. But we do start to question, what does that mean for me now? I created this elaborate spreadsheet to manage my part of the business, and I spend 80% of my day and 80% of my job is focused on that spreadsheet and on this elaborate process and tool set that I've built over, let's say, 20 years. Well, that's a threat that creates fear and anxiety, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so we've got to figure out how do we address that? How do we create clarity of, just because your spreadsheet is going away and becoming automated doesn't mean that you're not important to this organization. And just because that spreadsheet is going away doesn't mean your job's going away. Your job's going to change, but now let's define what it looks like. and let's create that vision of what your job looks like so that that person now suddenly gets excited about it again instead of being worried about the unknown. And too often, project teams and organizations create a huge amount of uncertainty by not clarifying and not understanding themselves what the changes are going to entail. So, in other words, they say, we're going to put in technology to automate a business process. We're going to get rid of that spreadsheet that you've been managing for 20 years to do your part of the business. And don't worry, your job's going to be a lot easier now. Now that you won't have to worry about that spreadsheet. Well, that sounds good in theory, but then when I really start to think about it, I think, well, what am I going to do? Like, what's my job going to look like? What am I going to do day to day? And if that's a question I don't have a good answer to, or that no one else in the organization has a good answer to, you can rest assured I'm not going to support the change. I'm not excited anymore. Now I'm probably at best neutral, best case scenario, but more likely I'm a resistor. I'm going to resist this change. I want change for everyone else, but I don't want my world to be disrupted in a negative way. And so that's the way we have to really understand sort of the psychology of how organizations operate and how people think, because that's an important part of it. So that's the key. Change readiness uncovers some of these sources of resistance. Once you've done the change readiness, then you can get a little bit more prescriptive about what the different types of changes or change management tactics can be used to address those things. So here's an interesting comment from Adnan on LinkedIn. I think managers are unable to see the hidden part of the iceberg, but leaders do. It's a great point. Interesting comment. So in other words, maybe mid-level managers don't typically see the hidden part of the iceberg, but leaders do. I think the good leaders do, but I would also caveat or maybe add to what you're saying that there are leaders that don't understand the hidden part of the iceberg. On the flip side, I've known a lot of mid-level managers that actually do understand the hidden part of the iceberg because they're closer to the front line people that actually are going to be affected or have that sort of resistance to change. So I sort of agree with you, but I think it depends on the organization. But good leaders do see it. I mean, good leaders will look underneath the surface in the tip of the iceberg. I think they're really dangerous. I don't want to say they're dangerous leaders, but the dangerous behavior of leaders is to assume that I see the tip of the iceberg and I assume that's the entire iceberg. And it happens a lot. I mean, a lot of times leaders just don't understand that this is not a technology initiative and that by trying to make the business more efficient, more effective, more scalable, generating more revenue, all the positive things they're trying to do, they have to understand that there is short-term negative perceived consequences to that, and they have to address that. And they can't assume that the entire organization is going to think like them, which is to lead the organization and do what's best for the organization. They have their own self-interest to protect too. And that self-interest and that that individual fear, uncertainty, and doubt is very, very powerful, especially when you multiply it by however many employees you have. So great point and great question there. Another interesting comment here is from Sinem from LinkedIn. Technology plays a pivotal role in this process. Take into account the perspective of the employee to enhance the overall experience. So totally agree. Technology is important, but you also want to take into account the perspective of the employee and really, what is that employee experience and what is that employee impact? What is the change impact to each major work group in the organization and each individual in the organization so that we can create a communications and change management plan that addresses those specific needs and concerns. Here's a question from Ghassan on LinkedIn. Leadership may be in, but they need to be committed throughout the digital transformation journey and beyond. And that's a great point because on the surface, most leaders that we work with are committed. They're in. They support the project. But what they don't do is maintain that high level of commitment or that visible level of commitment throughout the entire project. What ends up happening is they sort of delegate the project to a project team. They set the tone and the vision for the project, which is very important. But then they sort of back off and let the project team manage the whole thing. And they need to do that to some degree. Don't get me wrong. They have to delegate. The CFO or the CIO or the COO of the company cannot be the project manager that's in, all the details of a project. But what they can do is make sure that they're getting support and buy-in from the rest of the leadership. So making sure that the leadership team is actively involved in making major decisions around what our business is going to look like in the future and what we want to be when we grow up and how technology that we're deploying right now is going to help us get there. What you can't do is assume that the project team is just going to figure it out. They're going to go figure out how to design these new business processes and put in the new technology and change people's jobs and all that stuff. There has to be some sort of project governance there and sign off process where, yes, the project team might come forth and say, hey, this is what we see as a potential future state operating model to support what the goals and objectives of the organization are. But it really needs to be the leadership team that ultimately blesses that or signs off on it or changes it and sort of gets their fingerprints on that future state design so that everyone's on the same page and that so the project team is delivering what's expected from the rest of the organization. What you can't do is say, we want to put in new technology to make us more efficient, more scalable, generate more revenue, make our jobs easier, et cetera, et cetera. Now, project team, let's go get that done. You can't just stop there. You have to be involved and you have to do some of the dirty work and rolling up your sleeves of really understanding and defining what those future processes are going to be, how it's going to change people's jobs, how you might, standardize processes, how you might consolidate parts of the organization, that sort of thing. So, I'll give you a good example. A lot of clients we work with are private equity owned companies. And so they're mid-size, high growth companies. They've got a lot of private equity money behind them. They go out and they buy a bunch of companies to fuel their growth, both organically and through mergers and acquisitions. Then someone decides, hey, we've bought all these companies now. We're highly inefficient though, because we're fragmented, we're siloed, we're acting like a bunch of different companies, which we essentially are because we just went and bought a bunch of different companies. So now let's start acting like one company. Let's have common business processes, common tool set. Let's consolidate the organization so we sort of have, less redundancy throughout the organization. All that stuff sounds great. But those are really big changes. I mean, those are massive changes you're talking there as far as taking, let's say, 5 different accounting departments now and consolidating into one accounting department that supports the entire organization. Or taking a end-to-end supply chain process that is replicated 5 different ways throughout the organization because you have 5 different companies that were acquired. Now you're trying to come up with one way of running your supply chain, or at least one common way of running it. Those are massive changes that a project team is not going to be able to do on their own, not because they're incapable or incompetent, but because it has to be the leaders that set the tone and the level expectation and the definition of what those processes and organizational changes are going to look like. If leaders don't do that, what ends up happening is the project team will follow the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is to not change, to not standardize processes, to not consolidate functions, to not make massive, major changes, tectonic shifts to the business. That is the path of least resistance because it's a lot easier just to stay put, and the known of the status quo is very powerful. The unknown of future state processes that we don't understand, that's something we can't get behind. I mean, it's just how do you support something you don't understand? And so that's the reason why leaders have to be the ones to set that tone and be actively involved in setting that blueprint for what the future organization is going to look like. But too often what we do as leaders is we set that really high level tone and vision. We put together a project team. We hire a big system integrator to come in and help implement technology, and we hand it off to them. And again, if you do that, you can rest assured you're not going to get the business value you expected. And you can rest assured you're going to get a lot of resistance to change because the tone hasn't been set from the top and the top hasn't been nearly active enough in the definition of the business processes. Here's an interesting comment that will, I think, generate a good discussion here. This is from seen him again on LinkedIn. Streamlining the number of tools and apps can alleviate resistance. An all-in-one digital platform would be the ideal, reducing the learning curve and fostering a collaborative workplace culture. Simplifying processes leads to smoother transitions. So I agree, it can, but what I'll say to that is that just the fact that you're putting in a single tool, an all-in-one platform, something that's easier to learn, that I would agree with you long-term, that yes, that is true. You will get better adoption. It's less of a learning curve if you have one single integrated system. But you look at where you are today, and let's just say you have 100 different systems. To go from 100 different systems to one, long term, again, that will probably that could benefit an organization immensely long term. In the short term, though, you have to deal with the disruption of the fact that you're taking away 99 or maybe all 100 of your systems and consolidating into one. So the question then is, how do you mitigate that risk? It's not enough to say that long term it's going to be a benefit and therefore people will adapt to it, because they won't necessarily. In 10 years from now, yes, maybe as you hire new people and you bring them on board, you've got those processes and technologies well established and in place, then yes, they're probably going to reap the benefits that you talk about there. But in the short term, there could be actually a potential negative benefit, which is, in other words, you're going to be less productive because you're shifting to one system. You've got these change management issues we talked about. There could be operational disruption at the time of your go live, meaning because of some of this resistance to change and some of this lack of clarity around processes and roles and responsibilities, that can actually lead to lost business value at the time of go live. And that's why so many implementations or digital transformations fail, is because organizations don't navigate that stuff very well. And so I agree with your statement longer term, but I think the question is, how do we bridge that gap between where we are today to that future state utopia that ultimately will be more effective and adaptable for the organization? A lot more people dropped in the chat here, by the way, where they're from. We've got additional people from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, Delhi, India, Germany, Vietnam, another one from Germany, Canton, Ohio, etc. So thank you everyone for joining here today. And thank you for all the great questions here. There's a ton here that I'm trying to keep up with. So thank you. Here's another interesting point from Michelle on LinkedIn. Michelle says mid-level managers have to manage up and down and have a lot on their plate. I think they understand the iceberg better. That being said, they will also be the ones to sink the project. They could be the ones to sink the project for sure. I think you're onto something here with the mid-level managers, because mid-level managers are really key to organizational success during digital transformation. Of course, leaders, sort of the top executive leaders, they are too. They're the ones that have to set the overall tone and vision for the organization and have that clear vision and have that, what do you want to call it? The general direction and clarity of where the organization is headed. But it's really the mid-level managers that, without them, none of that vision matters. The executives can define all this future state stuff all they want, but if you don't get your mid-level managers on board, involved in that process and committed to those changes, it's not going to happen, because the people below them are the ones that are going to follow their lead more so than even the overall leaders of the organization. So mid-level managers are really key to making or breaking the project. And oftentimes, leadership teams or digital transformation project teams oftentimes forget about them or neglect mid-level managers and sort of skip past it. So you really have to make sure that, you work your way down the organization, starting with the top, making sure they're aligned and have clear vision and clarity on what they want. Then you work down to mid-level managers, and then certainly your frontline employees, you want to get them aligned as well at that point. So great point and comment there. There's a chat going on here about different types of change management strategies and tactics over on the LinkedIn feed. But one of the things I'll pull out from that back and forth from Kyler on LinkedIn, she says, Dan, well said. We've seen more of a cookie cutter change management approach from vendors, which often fails. And I would agree with that. Software vendors typically have a very cookie cutter approach to change, which we all want repeatable processes and proven best practices and that sort of thing. But change management is something that's highly prescriptive. I mean, it should be, to be effective. You need to be highly prescriptive as to what it is that you need to do to affect change within your specific organization. And not only that, but within specific parts of your organization, you're going to have different strategies and tactics you deploy throughout the organization based on what you find in your organizational assessment along the way, as well as what you see and how the organization evolves and reacts to change as you're going through a digital transformation. So cookie cutter approaches you have to be really careful of. The big software vendors and the big system integrators are notorious for coming in and saying, yep, we've got a whole change management strategy and plan that'll solve all these problems. And really what it is software technology training. And that's great, but you're skipping past all the really important foundational stuff and just getting down to the brass tacks, which we'd all love to do, right? We'd all love just to get to the end point and just get on with it. But unfortunately, we can't do that if we want to be effective. We have to set the groundwork for leadership alignment and clarity and definition of future state operating models and work our way down through the mid-level managers. And then eventually, then yes, you're getting to the end user training to show people how to use the technology to do all these new processes and new organizational roles and responsibilities that we've already worked through as part of our change management process. What one dynamic that happens a lot that you have to be careful of is when you have this training focused strategy for change management. In other words, you focus on end user training and adoption, but you don't do, I'll call it real change management. Even though training and adoption is part of real change management, it's only one dimension of real change management. But when you just focus on training and adoption, or that's sort of the primary focus of your change strategy, what ends up happening is you get to the training of your end users where you're training people in mass. And this is shortly before go live. And in a classroom setting or in a user adoption and in a training sort of setting, you start to get people that start freaking out, for lack of a better word. That's a technical term that I like to use. The organization freaks out. The frontline employees freak out because now they see that this is a massive change. This is a lot different than the way we do things today. And back to the spreadsheet example, that spreadsheet, that elaborate spreadsheet that I've been using for 20 years to do my job, and I created that spreadsheet, by the way, you're telling me now that's going away, and now I've got to use technology to do that job, or now, even worse, in the short term for me personally, you're telling me the technology is going to automate a big part of my job. Well, what in the world does that mean? I mean, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my value to the organization? And why would I get behind this when I'm really, you're asking me to support something that's going to hurt me in the short term? I'm speaking as someone who perceives it that way, of course. So that's the sort of dynamic you have to work through, because that you don't want that to happen in a training pre-go live environment where you're 30 days or whatever, 60 days away from go live. You go do some end user training and people start freaking out. That freak out will happen. It should happen. It needs to happen, but that should have happened months ago. Early in the process, that should have happened, to where by the time you get to training, it's more of a formality of, yeah, we get it. We understand that my spreadsheet's going away. My job's going to change. I'm finally comfortable with all that. Now just show me how I'm going to do it in the new technology. And that's what training should be focused on. But too often, back to Kyler's question, too often the vendors, big system integrators are really notorious for this. They say, we're going to spend all this time and effort and money on training, on an elaborate training program, but that training program backfires, not because the training isn't good, but because you haven't done all the foundational stuff early in the process to get people comfortable with the change and to let them freak out. You have to let the organization freak out, because they will. So it's your choice as to when they freak out. Are they going to freak out right as you're ready to go live and pull the trigger on new technology and you're just days or weeks away from going live? Or are you going to do it months in advance so you have time to work through it and address it before go live? And my strong suggestion would be the latter, which is do it sooner, because A, it's going to make your life a lot easier, but B, it's going to minimize the likelihood of having a material operational disruption at the time you go live. And that's sort of a dark side of digital transformation that we don't talk about much in this industry, but we need to, which is operational disruption is the biggest cost of digital transformation, yet we rarely quantify it, if ever. And operational disruption is can't ship product, can't close the books, can't run payroll. Major show-stopping sorts of things that we didn't anticipate and ends up happening to our organization because we didn't do change management right, among other things. It's not the only thing that can cause that dynamic, but change management is typically one of the leading culprits of why a project does or doesn't create operational disruption at the time of go live. Here's a difficult question. I'll try to answer it anyway. It's from Devendra on LinkedIn. Devendra says, how should ERP software be planned to help make a perfect implementation for change management? What are the top 3 most important things, according to you? So let me try and take a stab at 3 of the things that I think are most important from a change management perspective during an ERP software implementation or any sort of technology initiative or digital transformation. I'd say in no particular order, but more maybe sequential order would be the change readiness assessment. That's what we talked about earlier in this discussion around assessing qualitatively and quantitatively the organization and understanding where those pockets of resistance lie and uncovering the base of the iceberg, getting below the tip of the iceberg to understand what the sources of resistance are, what the pockets of resistance are within the organization, and how severe those sources of resistance are, So that's the first thing, is that organizational assessment, that understanding of how ready we are for change. And it's not really a question of if there's going to be change management resistance, but where is the change management and how severe is it and what are we going to do about it? So I think that's an important thing to frame or maybe change in your way of thinking. Instead of asking yourselves, will our organization resist change? You have to assume that yes, they will, because they will. I've yet to see an organization or client after over 1,000 digital transformations I've been involved with over 25 years, at varying levels. It I've yet to see an organization that did not struggle with change, and I've yet to see an organization that did not, after the fact, tell me change was a lot harder than they thought it would be. And so you have to sort of trust that, or just proactively recognize that, and also recognize that, what are the consequences of being wrong on that? The consequences are a lot greater that let's just say you're worried about overcommitting resources to change management. Well, the risk of that is in the consequences of that, if that is true, which I strongly suggest it is never true. But let's just say perhaps you're worried about overcommitting resources to change management. That's a smaller price to pay than doing the other extreme, or going too far the other way of not investing enough in change management. Those consequences are much more severe. So you have to look at it from a sort of a risk adjusted perspective. So that's what that organizational readiness piece can do. It can help you identify where the resistance is. That's one thing. The second thing that I'd say is an important change management strategy and tactic or tool is fully understanding your change impact. So understanding department by department, location by location, who's impacted, how are they impacted, um, how are their jobs, or sort of what is the gap analysis between current state and future state for different people throughout the organization, because you have to be able to articulate to people what their jobs look like. And again, the dynamic that you have to watch is that so many project teams, software vendors, system integrators, implementing technical consultants, they all tend to look at things more focused on the future state. And they say, okay, we're just going to deploy technology that does A, B, and C. And that's great. You have to do that. But organizationally, from a change management perspective, we have to understand the current state and how the current state is changing, and how specifically the future state is going to look for each individual within the organization, so that we can paint that vision for them, so that we can let them freak out. Back to my technical term, they can freak out as soon as possible in the process, and we can address that resistance to change. So that change impact, I'd say, is a second. And then I'd say a third, if I were to pick my top three most important change management strategies or tactics, a third would be the organizational design, clearly defining how reporting relationships are going to look, and also how job roles and responsibilities are going to look. So in other words, not just looking at a business process or workflow and understanding the change impact, but also defining what the job itself is going to look like. And they're somewhat related, but I think it's worth calling out organizational design as another one. And I also put that in my top three because it's probably, I can make a strong case that it's the most important change management tactic that is also the most overlooked in terms of organizational design. So those would be my sort of knee-jerk reaction to what the top three things are. The top three most important things are for change management. Krishan on LinkedIn says very impressive. So thank you. I'm not sure what exactly is impressive, but hopefully you mean this conversation, and hopefully you're enjoying and getting value out of it. So thank you for your comment there. Here's an interesting comment framed in a really good way that might be better than the way I've been saying it so far here today. This is from Anna Paula on LinkedIn. Anna Paula says, potential resisting factor is also related to how WIFM is addressed. And WIFM stands for what's in it for me. So in other words, a potential resisting factor is related to what's in it for me. So that's a great way to put it. And you do have to think or empathize and put yourself in the shoes of employees and understand how they think. And, I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but individuals are self-serving. No matter how altruistic or good you think you are, and you may be, you still are going to do what's in your best self-interest to some degree. Some people more than others, of course, but all of us, myself included, and I would suggest that all of us listening here today are self-serving humans. That's just I don't know if it's strength or a weakness, a flaw, or whatever you want to call it, but it's just the reality. So we have to accept that and figure out, how do we help people understand what's in it for them. And the beauty of this is that Most of the time when we go through change management or when we go through digital transformation, any sort of change initiative, most of the time for most of the organization, there is a net positive what's in it for me, or there will be. The problem is we don't clearly articulate that. We say it's, I'll give you an example. We'll say things like, well, Eric, you should be on board with this because it's going to help you do your job better. You're going to be more effective. It's going to be easier. You're not going to have to manage multiple spreadsheets. You're not going to have to make phone calls and send emails to get data that should just be right in front of you on your computer. Or, you're not going to have to dig into the system to get pieces of information that should just be on a dashboard you log into, or get a push notification alert every day or whatever. Those are all positive things, and those sound good. Like, yeah, that sounds great. That does help me, but that's more of a long-term utopia future state. The problem I'm going to have in the what's in it for me focus is, what about from here to there when we get from point A to point B? There's this sort of unknown chasm there of, yes, it might take us a couple of years to get to this point where I've got this utopia future state. But in the meantime, I'm going to lose my spreadsheet. You're going to change my job. You're telling me you're going to automate part of my job. I spend half my time looking for that data. I don't like doing it, but I spend half my time doing it. So now you're telling me that's going to get better, but what am I going to do with my time? So I start to worry that actually this could be a net negative for me, because I might lose my job, or I might not be valuable to the organization anymore. And so that's the stuff we have to overcome in terms of the what's in it for me focus. I totally agree. You have to paint that vision of what's in it for me, but you also have to understand that the utopia future state isn't always a perceived net positive individually during the transition, when we don't know what's going to happen to our jobs or what's going to happen to our heroics and the tribal knowledge and the fine-tuned processes that we've developed over years and decades of being as part of an organization. So great point in question there. Here's an interesting question. It's from Vin on YouTube. Vin says, what would be best practices for leaders to check in, ensuring the digital transformation team is constantly engaged and motivated? That is a really good question. And you're sort of tapping into a big problem with digital transformations, is motivation. How do you keep people from burning out, especially the people that are actively involved in the digital transformation, because they're under so much pressure to hit these milestones and deadlines. Oftentimes, by the way, these milestones and deadlines are artificially compressed. They're not realistic, and we're expecting people to execute an unrealistic plan that we never, we're going to realistically achieve. Now we're putting on all this pressure on the digital transformation team to accomplish these unrealistic goals and objectives. So, I mean, first of all, the best thing leaders can do is have a realistic plan. Another dynamic that's worth noting is that a lot of organizations, or a lot of digital transformation teams, have this bad habit of getting a proposal from a software vendor or a system integrator and using that as gospel and saying, okay, vendor/system integrator says this is going to be an 18-month project, so this is an 18-month project. Problem is, vendors and system integrators are oftentimes overly optimistic or have unrealistic assumptions in how they got to that 18 months, or they don't have a complete plan of all the things that are required to make that project happen. In other words, they are focused on what they need to do and what they can get done in 18 months. But that doesn't mean your business is going to change, and all this change management stuff we're talking about is going to happen in 18 months. It also, by the way, typically doesn't include other things like process improvement and defining process changes and doing the data migration and defining analytics and integration and architecture, all this stuff that oftentimes falls outside the purview of a system integrator or software vendor, but is super critical to a digital transformation. That stuff is more commonly, or more often than not included in that initial proposal that they provide you. So now you get this 18-month proposal for $5 million, whatever the number is, $5 million to implement 18 months. Suddenly you use that as gospel. You put the expectation on your team. We're going to do this in 18 months, and you've got $5 million to do it. Problem is, it was always going to take you 36 months and $10 million. That was always the more realistic number. But now you're expecting the team to get it done for less when it's not realistic. So that pressure is very real, and it adds up, and it can burn out a project team. And just in general, even aside from that dynamic, digital transformations are hard. It's a lot of work. There are just so many decisions and activities that need to happen during a digital transformation that can be overwhelming. People do get burned out. So a couple of things you can do is, first of all, set realistic expectations from the start. That's probably the most important thing you can do, because then you're less likely to put this artificial, unrealistic pressure on your team that's going to lead them to burn out faster. Secondly, is you want to make sure you have the proper amount of staffing and resources on the project, because one of the reasons why organizations and teams get burned out is because they don't have enough people supporting the project. They think that they can get by with just 5 people instead of 10, or, or 5 half-time people instead of 5 full-time people on the project. And they try to skimp, or what's more common nowadays in sort of this post-COVID world is that so many organizations are lean or leaner than they've ever been, and they just don't have the bandwidth or the internal capacity to take on one of these projects. And if that's the case, if that's just the reality, you cannot staff up your project any more than you already are. Then the other lever you can pull on is, well, instead of that 18-month project, maybe we do need to throttle back to 24 or 30 or 36 months and go at a steadier, slower pace, knowing that we don't have enough people on this project internally. And here's a dynamic you have to watch for: is you're going to get resistance externally from the organization, from your software vendor and system integrator, who's going to insist that you need to do it in 18 months and that you can do it in 18 months because they make more money faster if you do. So that, again, back to what's in it for me and economic self-interest. Software vendors and system integrators are the same way. They're looking out for their self-interest, and oftentimes they are giving advice and making proposals that self-serve them, but don't self-serve you. And so you have to look at the reality of, or add a dose of reality to whatever plan you get from a system integrator or a software vendor, and you have to right size it for you. And if you're short staffed, you're lean, you don't have enough people to support this project, don't go in with that 18-month unrealistic project when you could extend that out to 24 or 30 or whatever you need to. Now, of course, you want to be aggressive. You want to manage the project. You want to make sure this doesn't turn into an endless cycle that doesn't go anywhere. You don't want that. So you do want to be aggressive. You want to have accountability. You want to have milestones, all that stuff, but you also have to be realistic about it. And too often organizations are completely unrealistic around all the assumptions. So that's, one of the other things you can do is just make sure that you have realistic resourcing on the project that will reduce burnout and reduce the need to go out of your way to keep people motivated. And also, there is some health to letting people cycle in and out of the project within reason. You don't want to turn over the entire team and have people, just staying on for 3 or 6 months and then moving out right away. But you can sort of selectively rotate people in and out. So you do bring in some fresh energy. And as people start to get tired, you can let them go. Some of them go back to their day jobs while you're rotating in others. That's an art and science. So you have to be careful with that, because again, you don't want to overdo it to where you have so much turnover that it creates turmoil. But there's a healthy amount of attrition on a project team to where you can allow people to go back to their jobs and also bring in new people, or, other team members that weren't a part of the project, but maybe have been part of the organization, bring them in to help support the project for periods of time. So that's something else you can do as well. So great question there around how to keep people engaged and motivated. The other thing I'd say too, as far as the engagement, to keep a digital transformation team fully engaged, you have to make sure the leadership team is fully engaged, because if they're not fully engaged, if the leadership team is not fully engaged and they're not supporting and being actively involved in the project, the digital transformation team will lose motivation very quickly. But if they see the leadership team actively involved in helping make these decisions, and they're sort of side by side in the, in the battle, if you will, in the change management battle, that's a very powerful non-monetary way to incentivize and motivate a project team. So there's a lot of questions floating around here around measurement, how you measure change. And what I'll say, maybe to simplify in the interest of time, is to say that, those organizational assessments that I talked about earlier, the quantitative organizational assessments, are a great way to quantify change. And those organizational readiness assessments, where you're measuring different dimensions of change, like communication, collaboration, data exchange, perceptions of leadership, those are things that we actually quantify and we track over time. So you can see how the organization is shifting and evolving, and you can compare your organization to others. And when you have a consulting firm like ours at Third Stage do that, that allows you, to kind of look at how do we compare to others, and how do we measure to other organizations in terms of that resistance to change. So that organizational readiness assessment is a key way to manage that change, or to measure that change management, and it can be a great way to benchmark it to other organizations, but also benchmark over time how your organization is evolving as well. This is from Devendra on LinkedIn. I just have to show it because I laughed at it. Devendra on LinkedIn says, "I like your voice, much similar to a robot voiceover." So thank you. I think thank you. I think you meant that as a compliment. So thank you. Um, Jamal on LinkedIn says, the entire team should work to make it happen. I agree. You want the entire team to make sure that you're um, all committed to making that change happen. Here's an interesting question here. Actually, I don't know that I've been asked this question before, so I have to think of how I'm going to answer it. This is from Gassan on LinkedIn. He says, conflict of interest for a system integrator to say he or she is going to address the change management initiative. It has been an unbiased entity that can come in and say halt at any stage of the digital transformation project. So I think he's commenting or saying or suggesting that he thinks that it is a conflict of interest. And I do tend to agree, because change management is something that will absolutely have, what's the word I'm looking for? There'll be tension between the needs from a change management perspective and what a technical implementation team wants to do and can do. In other words, a technical implementer can implement technology. And let's say, I'm going to go back to my 18-month example. When they propose 18 months and they say we can implement technology in 18 months, they can. They could probably do it in a lot less time, actually. They could probably do it in 3 months or 30 days. I mean, if they put enough resources on the project, they can probably build the technology they need to build as fast as possible. But I don't want to say that's the easy part of the project, but that's not the time commitment. That's not the thing that's going to determine how long this transformation really takes. What determines how long this transformation is really going to take is change management, it's decision making, it's defining business processes, how long it takes us to make decisions around our business processes. It's figuring out how we're going to integrate the new technology to the legacy technologies that remain. It's figuring out how the data is going to be migrated into the new system. Those are the things that are going to turn the project from an 18-month project into a 24, 30, 36-month project, all the stuff I just mentioned. So it is somewhat of a conflict of interest to have a software vendor or system integrator come in and say, no, it's not going to take you 3 years. We're going to do this in 18 months. And they're indirectly or maybe unintentionally sort of putting a gun to your head saying, no, you are going to change it this fast. And when the change management team comes in and says, no, we can't change that fast, we need more time, a lot of times system integrators and software vendors will say, well, that's because you're resisting change and you just accept our best practices and you can do this a lot faster if you would just be quiet and just stop complaining about resistance to change and just do it. That's sort of, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's the sort of the summary results that you often see in that tension between change management and technical implementation. Same can be said for all these other things I mentioned too, like data migration, process improvements, system architecture and integration. Those are all things that are going to create tension between sort of the reality of what it's going to take to get the digital transformation done right versus doing a pure technical implementation. We all have to remember, this isn't like back, if you're old enough to remember the big Windows 98 migration, back when organizations were all sort of shifting from Windows 95 or whatever it was to the big upgrade to 98. A lot of times CIOs think, well, that wasn't that difficult. I mean, it was just sort of like we reinstalled the new operating system, and how hard can it be? This is different because we're not putting in a new operating system on everyone's computer. We're putting in massive wholesale changes to the way we operate as a business. That's the part that takes extra time. So that's the way we have to really think about it. So these are all great questions. There's a lot here we have not gotten to, and I apologize. I feel like we could have a whole nother session just getting through these questions here. In fact, Gassan, as I was saying that, just had a comment here that I saw. He took the words right out of my mouth. Gassan on LinkedIn says, need a part 2 of this podcast. Enjoyed it. Thanks, Eric. We will absolutely have to do a part 2 of this podcast, and I'll probably have to pull a lot of these questions back into the conversation. And you've provided a lot of good content for us to answer in our podcast. If you ever listen to the full Transformation Ground Control podcast, by the way, our opening segment in the podcast is typically to pull questions from social media, and we'll answer those questions in the podcast. So again, those full episodes of Transformation Ground Control come out every Wednesday. And this episode will be next week, next Wednesday. And so be sure to listen. We'll probably use a lot of your questions in the Q&A segment of our podcast. And by the way, as I mentioned before, you can watch our weekly podcast, listen to our weekly podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, or you can just look for it on audio podcast platforms. We also stream it to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. A couple other things before we close out and sort of wrap it up here today. I want to share two things with you. One is I have a new book that's coming out. Actually, it's my first real book, I'd call it, the first full-length book I've ever published. I've always wanted to do it. I've finally done it. It's a book called The Final Countdown. It's about digital strategy for digital transformation. You can learn more about that and pre-order the book at thefinalcountdown.com. So be sure to check that out. That'll be out on Amazon on August 25th, I believe it is. So later this month, in just a few weeks, my new book, my first book, will be published that day. So be sure to go to thefinalcountdown.com. You can put your name on the list to get notified when the pre-sale happens here in just a couple weeks. Secondly, I want to invite you to our upcoming Digital Stratosphere Conference, which is October 4th through the 6th in Denver. It's our first in-person Digital Stratosphere since COVID. We did a few of them before COVID, and then we went to all remote digital online. This is our first one, our first time resuming the in-person event. You can get early bird pricing for about another week through August 15th. You can get early bird pricing, which saves you a lot of money actually for the registration. So be sure to go to stratosphere2023.com. We've got the agenda work in progress on there, even though we're constantly adding to it and adding new speakers. You can see what speakers are going to be there. I'll be there, of course. A lot of us from Third Stage will be there. We'll also have people from other organizations, other thought leaders in the digital transformation space. We'll talk a lot about change management because it's so important and it's a passion of mine. So the conference will focus heavily on change management. We'll also have live entertainment too, networking opportunities. We'll have an 80s cover band, which if you know me, you know it would only make sense that I would have an 80s cover band in an event that I'm a part of. On the Thursday night, there's a concert with an 80s cover band. We'll also have networking opportunities throughout the event as well. So be sure to check it out. If you want to learn more, go to stratosphere2023.com, and I hope to see you in Denver for that. So that's what we've got for you today. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate all the great questions and engagement. You made this a lot easier than I thought it'd be. I always prefer to have a guest on the show, someone I can interview, but this is great because it's just more us talking, which was a lot of fun. So thank you for all the great comments and questions as we go here today. Again, make sure that you check out this podcast, transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see new episodes every Wednesday, and you can also find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you all for your time. Great conversation. If you have other follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. If you want to chat more about change management type stuff, or if we can help your organization, certainly feel free to reach out to me. And hope you have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on our Transformation Ground Control podcast. Have a great week, great day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.